So we're going to introduce ourselves. We'll start with Chris.
Hey, I'm Chris. I'm a college senior. I use he, him pronouns. I'm majoring in political science, and my main research interest is social movements and the environment, specifically climate change. So very fortuitous, alignment of all of my interests. Um, I'm planning on writing my thesis on the sort of emerging movement around climate change, and I joined XR in March. Um, in my free time, I like reading books, folding origami, hiking and running in nature, and also baking. And I have two cats.
Hey, I'm Diana, and I am actually mainly a musician and a music teacher. I just recently started volunteering with Extinction Rebellion as part of an effort to find some way of meaningfully engaging in society in my spare time to help move us in a better direction. My academic background is actually geography with an emphasis on development and environment. I studied at UC Berkeley. That was before I went the direction of becoming a musician and teacher. So I'm here as an engaged citizen who sees a need for urgent action, trying to do what I can. And I also have a cat who is right there.
Aww, cute cat. All right. Well, I used to have a cat when my children were growing up. And I'm a grandmother. I'm a sixth generation San Franciscan. And now my granddaughters, my son and daughter-in-law live at 30th and Moraga, right there in the city. So I feel a very special responsibility for the future of my town and my grandchildren. And that's exactly why I'm working with Extinction Rebellion as a 71-year-old aspiring elder doing nonviolent civil disobedience, often in the streets of my birthplace of San Francisco, disrupting business as normal, expressing my beliefs and values in the public square. I want to first acknowledge with respect the indigenous peoples of this land. I honor the up to 10,000 years or more that they lived in harmony with their environment. Here in California, some of the artifacts found are up to 5,000 years old, which is older than the Egyptian pyramids. Good grief. So I respect their caring relationship with their land and kin, and I am very cognizant of the history that took away their land and culture and so many of their lives.
So we don't need to, sorry, I'm going to read the title of this talk is Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. So right there, you kind of have a preview. We don't need to tell you that climate change is real or that it's a threat. However, we do want to make clear the urgency and seriousness of the situation, which is not always understood. I know that I personally grew up with a fair amount of environmental awareness. My mom was actually she chaired the Bay Area Sierra Club chapter in the 1980s. I mentioned that earlier if you were here, and was very active in the anti-nuclear movement when I was a kid. So my activism was mostly as a child and now again. So it's only in the last few years that I've become aware of what a dire situation we're really in and what a short timeline we are looking at. It's obvious that the climate is changing. The heat waves that we've had here in the Bay Area in the last few years are nothing like what I experienced as a child. I actually live in my childhood home. That's my background here is where I grew up, right here in Oakland. And it's an upstairs space, so the heat gets trapped, and I have no memories of anything like what we've had in the last couple of years. So that is obviously not scientific evidence, but these changes that I personally feel and experience are what trigger my sense of there being a true emergency that requires my attention. And this is what got me to start looking at the data. Next. So the climate group 350.org, we're probably all familiar with, founded by Bill McKibben, gets its name from the safe limit of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, which is 350 parts per million, according to scientists. This chart from NASA shows the level going back 800,000 years. And in 1950, we surpassed 300, and we are now at 414 and rising. These next images, also from NASA, show average variation of global surface temperatures over time. The dark blue indicates areas cooler than average, dark red indicates areas warmer than average. Here's 1884. We're just going to keep going through these. 1922, 1957, 1984, I was 4 years old here, 2007, and 2019, last year. So there is no question that the world is getting warmer. Next slide. This graph from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change illustrates the lag time between CO2 emissions and their impact on the climate. So if we bring our emissions to zero sometime in the next 100 years, which we know is enormous to be able to do that, it will still take a few centuries for temperatures to stabilize and possibly millennia before sea level stops rising. So this dotted blue line that you see kind of is projections for sea level rise. And the brown line shows a peak in carbon emissions. Today is the far left. So they're anticipating, if we did have a peak and then a drop, the red line shows temperature. So because of climate lag, we can expect the temperature to continue rising due to our past emissions, even as future emissions may drop.
And let's get local with the historical truth of life destruction at the hands of humans and their profit-making system, capitalism. Chevron, our neighbor, is a perfect example. Richmond has been an industrial town since the 1850s, when it all started here, poisoning its community members and all of the Bay, actually, starting with the manufacturing of equipment for the gold rush.
So coming back to, this is another slide from 350.org. And I put this here because I wanted to remind us that there is no meaningful debate about the science of climate change. There are people who want to say that there's disagreement in the scientific community. Maybe it's happening, but humans didn't cause it, or maybe humans did cause it, but it's really not that big of a problem. But just to remind us, there's 97% consensus among scientists that climate change is happening, caused by human activity. So this is something we're probably all pretty familiar with, but I think it's important to remember that Exxon and other fossil fuel companies have spent millions of dollars to manufacture this debate, sowing misinformation, and their own studies have made clear since the 1980s that global warming is real, caused by the extraction of fossil fuels. They actually started raising their oil rigs in anticipation of sea level rise, while simultaneously trying to tell the rest of society that this wasn't happening. Let's move to Chris for the next slide.
Yeah, great. So we've sort of given, this is obviously like a very brief overview of climate science, right? We want to focus this part of the presentation on what does climate change actually look like in the Bay Area, right? And so Molly talked about Richmond, and I'm going to talk about two other things that we all think are sort of the main ways that climate change impacts the Bay. The first one, in case you couldn't guess from the really obvious image, is wildfires. And this is just an image from the most recent fire season, the Sizu lightning complex that was in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Yeah. So there's a lot going on this slide. Basic idea that we're trying to convey is that there's a ton of different ways in which rising temperatures cause more wildfires. You have snow melting sooner, so forests are drier, more liable to catch fire. You have way more droughts, right? We had like a 7-year-long drought that only ended a year or two ago. And droughts also make forests more likely to burn. Heat waves during summer are liable to start fires, and the heat waves are longer, more intense. You have less rainfall. There's also insects that can survive in the heat and then like chew through trees and turn them into kindling, basically. All of this kind of adds up, right? And that's why since 1970, the number of acres that burn in California specifically every year has gone up fivefold, which is like crazy to think about, that like just a few generations ago, basically, we had nothing like the fire seasons that we've just had now, right? And if you project that kind of trend forward, then I mean, I'm scared of whether I'll be able to live in the Bay Area when I'm old, right? Because if the air isn't breathable for a large chunk of the year, then it's hard to imagine living here.
And this is a point where I wanted to just interject a personal connection that I grew up going to a music camp. I mentioned that I'm a musician that's out in the foothills of the Sierras. And over the last several years, those bark beetles that Chris was talking about have done exactly that. Something like 90% of the trees there have been infested by bark beetles and are just standing timber. And on our piece of land, we've done a lot of clearing, but that area was burned by the creek fire this year. We were actually pretty lucky, but our property was burned, and that whole, it's personal to me. This is actually when I started getting involved in climate activism, is when I started to see all those trees dying. And I'm sure you all have similar stories, being people living in California. We're all doing it.
Yeah. The same thing kind of goes for me. Like, I'm sure we all have stories like this, right? But the reason that I ended up joining Extinction Rebellion, actually, well, one of the many was, I remember the first thing that sort of clued me was the campfire in 2018, because I was at college on the East Coast and I called my parents for a like weekly check-in, and they hadn't gone outside in a week because there were no N95 masks left that they could buy. And the air was so hazardous to breathe that they were scared of leaving the house. And this time, this fire season, which was the worst fire season that has ever happened that we have record of, they did have N95 masks because of the pandemic, which we'll talk about in a few minutes also. But that was the first thing, was the campfire, and realizing that like my grandma lives only a few dozen miles from where the campfire started. This time was also like a wake-up call this fire season, because I went hiking in the Big Basin Redwoods with my parents, and 2 days later, the area that I had been hiking in, which is like this massive 10,000 acre state park, all of it was on fire from the Sioux Lightning Complex. Most of the trees did survive though, because they were alive, and redwoods are very resistant to fire sometimes. But that was like shocking to me, that it could happen like right where I had been days ago. And yeah, I don't know. And then my parents and I just like trying to deal with the smog and not going outside for that month and a half or so. Yeah. So the next thing that we're going to talk about in terms of like how climate change impacts us in the Bay Area is sea level rise. I mean, like this, we all know how it works, right? You have higher temperatures at the poles, ice melts, ice turns into water, the oceans go up. The thing that really surprised me when I actually dug into what I could find about this with respect to the Bay is just how seriously Northern California gets impacted by sea level rise. So on the next slide, which should show up now, these are two maps of different temperature changes. So on the left, you have 1.5 degrees Celsius. On the right, you have 4. 1.5 is what is normally called the safe limit of warming. And the thing that really shocked me when I saw this for the first time is like at both levels, but especially at 4, you get large chunks of the peninsula, South Bay and East Bay, end up underwater, basically. That's not surprising though. That was kind of what I was expecting. What I wasn't expecting is that at 4 degrees, I hope you can all see this, that Sacramento is underwater because you have this like massive new body of water just like out east from where we are. I was dumbfounded. And the other crazy thing that you'll notice is that even at 1.5 degrees of warming, which is normally considered like what we're shooting for, right? This is our goal. You still end up with this giant body of water that could put some cities underwater. Like I think Stockton's right on the border. Yeah.
Tracy.
Yeah. Sacramento is basically a coastal town in that 1.5 degree.
Yeah.
So another aspect of climate change that we want to talk about, it's a little less local, but we're all experiencing it, is the coronavirus pandemic. So my experience is that people tend to talk about this unrelated to climate change. It's like another thing. It's its whole own thing. There's this pandemic, it's random, there was a virus, it got loose. However, I think that these are closely linked. So this image that we're looking at is the title from an article that discusses several epidemics over recent decades and their relationship to human-driven habitat destruction. Quoting directly from the article, the basic summary, research suggests that outbreaks of animal-borne and other infectious diseases like Ebola, SARS, bird flu, and now COVID-19 are on the rise. So even if these two things were not causally related, although I think that they are, another question to look at with this pandemic is why don't we react to the public health threat of climate change with the same urgency and willingness to sacrifice that we have used to fight this pandemic? I believe we need to look at the coronavirus pandemic not only as a symptom of a much greater problem of ecological breakdown, but as a call to action that goes far deeper than simply mitigating damage and hoping for a vaccine to save us. Although I am hoping for a vaccine. So I see this as part of what Joanna Macy calls the great unraveling. If you're not familiar with Joanna Macy, I'm guessing most people in this room would be, but she's an incredible spiritual teacher, guide, activist. So the great unraveling that hopefully becomes the great transformation. Things don't collapse all at once. Each part of the system is connected, and we can't always predict exactly how things will fall apart, but there's a pattern emerging, and the damage that we are causing to our life support system is becoming impossible to ignore.
All right, so we've sort of looked at how climate change impacts the Bay Area. And to me, that's sort of the first thing that I always think of is like, I love living in the Bay Area and I want to continue living there when I'm old. And if the air outside is toxic to breathe, then that, you know, is probably pretty hard to do. Or if like my childhood home and the place my parents worked goes underwater, then it's not really the same place anymore. But it's also important to zoom out and look at like the global level, right? And this is also part of why I started thinking about acting, is that we really are not on the right trajectory right now, basically. So I'm sure many people know in 2018, the IPCC released this report that was talking about, you know, we've been told 2 degrees Celsius is the safe limit. Actually, it's 1.5, and here is what we would need to do to get there. And it's basically a 50% cut in emissions within 12 years, now 10 years, and getting emissions globally to net zero by 2050, which is basically a full reversal of the last 200 years of trajectory that we're on. The other scary thing about this report that is not all that widely talked about is that even if we manage to do this, which is already like a daunting task, it only gives us coin flip odds of staying within the safe limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So to get more than a 50% chance of staying within that 1.5 number, you have to cut emissions like way, way faster, which is scary. The other scary thing is that the IPCC is kind of conservative by nature because it is prioritizing being scientifically bulletproof, like immune from criticism, over being perfectly accurate to the real world. So if there's uncertain science, they have to basically say, oh, we're not going to include these models. And so what this graphic shows is IPCC models of how much sea ice will there be versus what actually happens in the real world. And what you can see is that in the real world, ice is melting a lot faster than even the like maximum of what the IPCC thought would happen. And this is primarily because IPCC models don't look at tipping points in the natural ecosystem or positive feedback loops, because those are extremely hard to accurately model and it's really, really uncertain. And so those types of considerations just get totally excluded. But as a result, they underestimate how fast and how severe climate change is, which is what we're going to talk about now on a sort of global scale. So this is a very confusing graphic. It's basically all of the like tipping points and feedback loops that climate scientists have verified in academic research. And most of these, the IPCC like never mentions, right? The classic example is the albedo effect in the Arctic. So like ice melts because of warmer temperatures, then instead of ice reflecting sunlight back into space, you have the water absorbing the sunlight, so the ocean gets warmer and then more ice melts and it kind of snowballs and speeds up over time. I'm not gonna like waste a bunch of time trying to explain all of these tipping points. The basic idea is that like these are feedback loops that kind of trigger at a certain point. So at 3 degrees Celsius, or 3 to 5 really of temperature increase, you have the Amazon rainforest basically die back. It becomes too hot for most of the trees there to continue to exist. They either dry out or burn, or they become it basically means the Amazon becomes a producer of carbon instead of a thing that absorbs carbon, which is like insane to think about. And there's a bunch of others, but this paper, this graphic is based on this really big groundbreaking paper that was published 2 years ago. It took like 18 of the world's leading climate scientists in a bunch of different subfields and was like, okay, let's take stock of all the tipping points and positive feedback loops that we know about. And what they warn about in this paper that's like peer reviewed in the National Academy of Sciences is that if we don't take like really fast action right now on climate change, we might end up with a domino-like cascade of melting ice, warming seas, and dying forests that could tilt Earth into a hothouse state beyond which human efforts to reduce emissions will be increasingly futile. And the scary part is that they expect this hothouse state, if we do get here, would last upwards of 1,000 years, like truly beyond the time span of like anything we can imagine, basically. So if I haven't scared you enough, here's another really scary graphic. This is from The Guardian. It looks at 4 degrees Celsius temperature change. What does that look like for the world? The red zone, no one can live there anymore. That whole area has to be evacuated because heat waves are so lethal on that area that no one can live there basically for most of the year. The yellow zone, which is most of the world's population currently, also becomes extremely hard to live in. You have like the end of the monsoon in India, which means no water. And the graphic says that most of the human population has to live in the gray area, which is like Canada, Russia, like Scandinavia, and then New Zealand. You also have Southern Europe, like Spain, Italy, Portugal, turn into the Sahara Desert. It just like moves northward, which is not something I realized was possible to happen, but apparently it is. And the scary thing is that this is what we're looking at by the time I die, basically. This could be the world that I grow old in. Yeah, this really shook me when I saw it, because we're currently on track kind of for 4 degrees Celsius within, unless we do something. The next thing after this is kind of switching gears. So I'm sure many of us know, like the KT asteroid caused a mass species extinction, right? Asteroid killed the dinosaurs, all of that good stuff. What it doesn't get talked about that much is that there have been 5 extinction events that have killed like most life on Earth, like most species go extinct. And What the scientific evidence we have from the fossil record says is that CO2 has been the primary driver of most of these events. CO2 causing changes to like atmospheric chemistry and temperatures and the ocean, stuff like that. And this little graphic just shows like all of the warning signs that we know from these past extinctions are present today for the most part, which is why other animal species are going extinct at a rate that is 1,000 times faster than the normal rate, which is kind of a mind-boggling number to wrap your head around. But it really shows that like we are already in a crisis. And this raises kind of the final elephant in the room before we talk about like, what are we gonna do about all of this, right? Is like, what about us? And this is one like paper also in the National Academy of Sciences that kind of looks at like, what happens to humanity if we don't stop like severe climate change. And this paper basically concludes that once you go past 5 degrees Celsius, you might just have no more humans because like 75% of the world gets exposed to lethal heat waves for like months out of every year, like really crazy stuff. And it's like such a small number, but really what it means is that like 5 degrees Celsius in the summer, it means like 20 degrees higher heat waves because of like temperature variability. And this graphic also rates like, what is the probability of these events happening? So right now, the like really crazy end of civilization stuff doesn't look very likely, but it could become likely if we don't do anything. And the way I kind of think about this question is like, it doesn't really matter answering the question of like, will all of us die, you know, because we will all die at some point, right? But like, does humanity survive, you know? Like the real question is like, can we stop really catastrophic stuff from happening to humanity, regardless of whether it means like total extinction or not? And that's the thing that I'm kind of interested in trying to stop. So like the 3 degrees, basically. The problem is that we aren't doing enough right now. We need to be doing a lot. Even the IPCC, which as I sort of already mentioned, is kind of conservative and underestimates how bad things are, thinks that climate change demands rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society, which is kind of a crazy statement for like a scientific body to make. That is like, it's like, we have to change everything we're doing right now, or else really bad things happen. But yeah. And as I just mentioned, this is not happening yet. We need to do something to make this happen. This is a graphic of like, what kind of temperature increase are we looking at if everyone follows through on their Paris commitments? And basically, currently we're looking at 3 degrees Celsius higher temperatures by 2100, which is the catastrophic thing from the scientific paper looking at human survival. And I read recent research like a month or two ago that said we're actually on track for 4 degrees Celsius. But the basic idea is that countries are not cutting their emissions quickly enough right now. And we need to do something to change that. And what I sort of came to the conclusion of when I like read all of this, just like info dump that I just gave you, this like very sad, depressing information, right, is that we need a new approach because politics as usual it's failed, it's not working, right? James Hansen, who was the director of NASA, testified to Congress in 1988 that climate change was real, human caused, and very dangerous. In 1992, we created the UN FCCC, which is like the UN body that oversees climate stuff. It's responsible for the Paris Agreement, Kyoto. And this was all 30 years ago, basically. And since then, globally, we are burning twice as much carbon today per year as we were then. So even despite like huge public awareness campaigns, lots of lobbying efforts from amazing green nonprofits, even despite politicians who we thought would do something, like even with lots and lots of effort has been poured into this problem, right? You have like lots of renewable energy that is helpful, but even despite all of this, the last 30 years has just not worked. And so what we've sort of concluded at Extinction Rebellion is that we need something else. And the answer that we've come up with is basically like nonviolent direct action and social movements. So that's what we're going to talk about now.
So before we do that, before we just go right from, oh no, there's a problem, fix it, I want to invite us to just take a moment and feel what we just talked about, the weight of this and the grief that for me, I know has been huge when I really look at this. We are talking about an unlivable planet within a few generations, and I'm looking at within my lifetime. And certainly any of us who have children, grandchildren within their lifetimes. So I want to just take a moment of silence before we move on.
So I worry about whether my children will be able to have grandchildren, whether my granddaughters can have grandchildren. My daughter has already thought that she would not think it's responsible to bring children into the world. So I feel very obligated as much as possible to see what changes we can do here. And we are obligated to do direct action, to be a good human being. This is what I think as well, as Howard's in. And a concerned citizen living our values of care and compassion and claiming our relationship with Mother Earth and all life, all kin, all where we are related to it. And we are responsible, and we will act on our obligations.
Yeah. So I think for me, where this kind of obligation that Molly is talking about comes from is these questions, right? What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to die without regrets? Because when I started like really internalizing all of the scary stuff about climate, I kind of had this moment of like, oh my God, I have to do something. And the question that kind of keeps me going is like, when I'm old, someone will probably ask me like, what did you do once you knew? And I have to be able to say like everything I could, or else I will have failed myself.
So true. So real, Chris. Thank you. So I decided I want to be with an organization who's asking these kinds of questions. And I'm glad to be with others who have moved to act based on their values and beliefs, taking a moral and ethical stand for the good of future generations, and developing the resilient strategies to do everything possible in our work and actions. And I think it is essential that we will unite Black, brown, white, class, nationality, or gender. Every one of us, together, we can do it. And the children shall lead us. And I want to tell you, my husband is listening to the Greta Thunberg movie out in the other room right now. And this is what she said. You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. That's what she said to the world in 2019 through the UN. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? How dare you, the youth tell us. Wake up. This is our future. This is our lives. This is the future of the world. Wake up, and how dare you do nothing? So I will say there are people who've been doing things. And I say the saints shall show us how to do it. As good citizens and good people, we must act with moral responsibility. That's Chris.
Oh, I'm lagging. It's fine. Okay, I see it now. Yeah. So we all have some kind of responsibility or obligation to act. And the question is, if politics as usual is not enough to get it done, it's not enough to bring emissions to zero, then what is? And at XR, we think our answer is pretty simple and straightforward, which is direct action, civil disobedience, like grassroots social movements, basically kind of going back to the roots of part of like what has made so many movements successful throughout history, particularly like the environmental movement in the US. So this, I think, I can't see it yet. There we go. Is an image from a protest in the US against an automobile factory in the late 20th century. And the basic reason I'm putting this here is that the main idea that we're trying to convey is that social movements work, right? Protests, picket lines, strikes, direct action. These were sort of the things that won an initial slew of really significant victories for the environmental movement that created like landmark legislation that we could then use the courts to make sure people actually followed. And this kind of movement activity that creates the initial victory, we think is kind of, you can see it everywhere, right? Like the environmental movement was inspired by civil rights tactics, which was also another obvious example of really successful nonviolent action. And we have some others that we'd like to talk about.
So Gandhi is our first modern example of consciously formulated strategies of nonviolent civil disobedience. And prior to the 1950s, the American civil rights movement had few successes using traditional political approaches. But Martin Luther King showed the next steps.
You also have instances like ACT UP, which was an LGBT organization dealing with the AIDS crisis in the late 80s, where they used very disruptive tactics. And at the time, were very unpopular, like largely, and yet managed to win really significant victories in terms of getting federal funding to actually research treatments for HIV/AIDS, which kind of shows that even when you're doing really disruptive tactics that make a lot of people unhappy initially, you end up having really significant payoffs, kind of counterintuitively. And more recently, you have cases like the Standing Rock protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which would have put the water source of a lot of indigenous groups in direct danger of being polluted by oil spills. And while a lot of people think that these protests were a failure, I kind of take a different message away from it, which is that they were a partial success. They didn't get everything they wanted. The pipeline still got built, but they laid the groundwork for a court challenge that recently succeeded actually in kind of halting the pipeline until an environmental impact assessment can actually be conducted. So the question we think that is raised by like all of these historical cases, and obviously we could have like a lot more, right, is why do movements work? Why do they sometimes succeed? Why do they sometimes only partially succeed? Like what drives them to succeed, basically? And we think that in particular, there are sort of three things going on that make nonviolent direct action really successful.
So we thought nonviolent direct action needs to be undertaken respectfully because it draws attention to the cause, converting skeptics about the movement and lessening possible escalation into self-defeating violence. And Gandhi set the tone and respectfully banished the British Empire from his country. So these actions must also be disruptive. No two ways about it. It's not enough to demonstrate or protest. Oh yeah, let's disrupt this world of complacency. And the costs that civil disobedience imposes on the system must be made impossible to ignore. And beyond their beauty and camaraderie, successful actions must be sacrificial. That's a pretty strong word, but I've come to realize it's very real. Demonstrators accept the consequences of their actions with dignity and an understanding that perhaps everything must be put on the line to defend the sacred. So, are you ready to get arrested? It took me some years and some time and many protests to go to, and finally somehow my name got on the arrestable list. That's what we call it. And I wonder when I really will be willing to put my life on the line. My pondering, my question, what am I willing to die for as a grandmother, as a life giver? What is it at this point am I willing to die to make good for my grandchildren and your grandchildren? Uprising. Yeah. What is our obligation as rebels to today's events? We are participating and examining our structures and biases. And many of us are back in the streets in survival solidarity with our allies. And we are building relationships through shared values and focused action. There is no climate justice without racial justice. So that is why we are here. There are things that we can do, and there are ways to stop business as usual and its inevitable outcome.
Extinction Rebellion has 4 demands. The first one, tell the truth. Declare a climate and ecological emergency. You can read the small text on your own. This is an absolute minimum. There's a movement to declare climate emergencies around the world. Resolutions have been adopted. We have one in Berkeley, we have one in Oakland, and this is an important starting point. We need to face and name the situation plainly before we can begin to truly address it. Demand number 2, act now, halt biodiversity loss and go carbon neutral by 2025. As Chris mentioned earlier, the IPCC demands of a 50% reduction by 2030 is not good enough. That gives us a 50-50 chance of meeting that 1.5 degree target, which even if we get that 50-50 chance right, and we get that 1.5 degrees, that gives us Sacramento becoming a coast town. And we're at 1 degree now, and we already know what that feels like with the fires, with the pandemic. So the IPCC demands are not enough. We know that this is a tall order, but we need to listen to the science and ask for what we need, not what we think is politically realistic. Number 3, beyond politics, create a citizens' assembly for climate and ecology. This is a really cool one. I had never heard of this concept before working with XR. A citizens' assembly is basically like a jury where randomly selected citizens are tasked with making legal policy decisions. There are examples of this system. You could look up the Sortition Foundation. Sortition is another name for this selection process. Chris, you told me that this is in Ireland. There are successful examples of this. This is not something I know deeply about, but I am aware that studies have found that citizens, when informed by experts and given the opportunity to debate and examine the issues, will make much better decisions than our current system, where career politicians are too easily corrupted by lobbyists and the commercial interests they rely on for campaign funding. So this is an important part of the strategy. And number 4, a just transition. This one is worth reading because it has been a source of some contention within XR. And we believe that the fourth demand is an essential piece of the work we are setting out to do. So I'm going to read this to you. We demand a just transition that prioritizes the most vulnerable people and Indigenous sovereignty, establishes reparations and remediation led by and for Black people, Indigenous people, people from the global South, and poor people for years of environmental injustice, establishes legal rights for ecosystems to thrive and regenerate in perpetuity, and repairs the ongoing ecocide to prevent extinction of human and all species in order to maintain a livable, just planet for all. So that was a lot. The core is just, we cannot treat climate justice as an isolated issue. We have to also address the social inequities that are part of the same problem. So 1, tell the truth. 2, act now. 3, citizens assembly. 4, just transition. I'm going to read this. By joining together across racial lines, we can reject those trying to divide us, reduce racism, and nurture a society that simultaneously saves our planet and values each and every family, Black, brown, and white. So we were discussing this. This is not just a moral matter, although it is a moral matter. We believe it's also pragmatic from a strategic standpoint to build the largest possible coalition because we are all truly in this together. Chris is going to tell us about the history of XR.
Yeah. So we sort of talked about what XR wants to do about climate change and what our demands are. Briefly, right, we did not start in the US. The original XR group started in the UK, actually. And after they built up a lot of numbers, they mobilized across all of London. They basically shut down the entire city for 9 days. They blocked all the roads, they blocked all the bridges, you couldn't get in or out. And for 9 days, they just occupied London, like all of London. And then eventually the conservative government run, I think, by Boris Johnson at the time, although it might have still been Theresa May, came to the negotiating table. And despite being a conservative government, declared a climate emergency across the UK and committed to 2050 emissions targets, which is not enough, but it's like kind of surprising to me that this happened at all, given how polarized politics is in the US, I suppose. Since then, though, Extinction Rebellion has moved out of the UK and gone global.
Yeah, so that was in 2018, amazingly, not long ago. So it's spread to over 500 chapters on 6 continents. It's truly been a worldwide movement that unites all people. Of course, we are one of those chapters, and there's probably many more on this could be on that map. So now for us here in San Francisco, Extinction Rebellion SFA is a 100% nonviolent civil disobedience movement aimed at nothing less than radical system change. Our rebellion is fueled by our love for humanity and for all life on Earth. And this is what you will find when you come to our website, exactly that statement. And we are collaborating with local organizations who've been in the grassroots, on the ground, resisting, showing what our society could be with cooperation, caring, and compassion, and courage and power to effect change. I'm so grateful for the local Extinction Rebellion leadership. Oh, I see someone on the left of that. But what is happening is deeply sad and grievous. And I lament for what we have done and what we are facing now. I feel that Extinction Rebellion, SFA, understands the grief we are dealing with. This is a San Francisco protest versus Chase Bank in February 2020. So we've done protests that are aimed specifically at major influencers of climate change. And here is my friend Grace, and my other friend Peggy occupying a Chase Bank in downtown San Francisco just last February. And Grace is there under a shroud of death. And I'm grateful for companions together on this path. We need each other to do this work. We are acting to unveil the mistruths and the invisible harms suppressed by our society. We use our voices to declare that we will no longer put up with what is happening. We see it, we embody it, we'll tell the truth about it, and we'll change it. And these are our guides, the women who've been on the front lines for generations and generations versus colonization. And they've been my guide in activism because they have always been the protectors of Mother Earth. And they're still on the front line. Thank you for your leadership. And there they are. This is the climate strike. They were in the very front. Protect. Yes, they will protect our world and have been. We need to pay attention and listen. And this is one of our first protests. We do assemble, we disrupt, we love. And this is so great, right near the San Francisco Civic Center. How about that word truth on the wall of the building? Good stuff. So these are some more examples of action photos that we've done. So London, should I just go through these, Chris? London again.
People, a link to the video of the Chase Bank action that we weren't able to include the video in the presentation. So that link is now in the chat for you if you're curious to open it up and watch it later.
So great. It's 4 or 5 minutes, very professionally made.
I said 2 minutes, I lied.
Oh, 2 minutes. Anyway.
I could be wrong.
No, it's short and very exciting. And we have some professional actors and actresses working with us. So it's been a very rich relationship for all of us here in San Francisco. So we're just getting, a little sense of what it's been like. New York was the first chapter in the United States. And Los Angeles, I think, was close to being the second one. And then we were just after them. Oh, there's our dancers. There's the murals. Oh, right. This is so great. I think I was there. I was definitely at this one. See the top? Tell the truth. Divest from fossil fuels. And I think this was at a Chase Bank. And they trespassed to get on the roof of the building. But there are solutions to this situation. We have to see the vision and commit to it and act on it. So nonviolent civil disobedience is one flame used to get it done. Now we understand why Extinction Rebellion started and spread like wildfire across the globe. But right now, XRSFB is opening its strategies to include more visible alignment with regenerative actions. Yeah, what is it we can do to make a better world aside after we protest and get it changed? So we offer many ways for XR rebels to learn, be together, act together, building the culture we wish to live in. We are building our infrastructure internally in San Francisco and our presence here. So yes, you can join us individually. We can be in alignment as organizations. We live with purpose to transform our society. Welcome to the disruption and regeneration. Extinction Rebellion for life and for love. Yay. And then it's a good time for questions. I do have 2 slides here talking about the next possible steps that you could do. Let's take a quick look at that. Might answer some of your questions. Go to our website, go to an orientation. We do have 10 principles besides the 4 demands. And all we ask is that you join, that you say that you will act according to the principles and the demands. And then you have a one-on-one discussion with the Welcome Working Group. And I want to tell you, that's how the three of us got involved. So when someone follows up with you and talks with you about how to be involved and how to best use your gifts within an organization, it's been very motivating for us. And we have a lot of different groups in the chapter, and that's what they are. These are all our different working groups in the chapter. See if there's something more in the chapter.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's it.
All right.
So now we have a good amount of time for questions, I think.
Yeah. Anyone? We're open. What'd you think? I can stop share. We could talk. There. So was there something new that you environmentalists learned from this presentation? I'd be interested.
I'll launch in right now and ask you to tell us a little bit about some of the things that you have done that you see as successes, where you have actually achieved change.
Well, all right, Liz.
Well, I can answer the question, but I want you to.
Okay, good. Please answer it first. So I think we can talk about BlackRock.
Yes.
Right? And Chase.
Yep.
Okay.
And Chase. Yep, absolutely. Let's see. We have some questions here in the chat. One says, how many Bay Area active members are there?
I think there's around 50. That's what my sense is. I couldn't swear to it, but you know, Carol, yeah, I think it seems about right.
Yeah, and also worth clarifying that by 50, it means like 50 people who actively engaged, who are actively engaged in like one or more working groups, whereas there's like a lot of people who we peripherally sort of get involved in actions. And a lot of actions that XR has done in the Bay have been much larger than 50 people, obviously, largely because we work with other organizations that are also working on climate to, you know, get numbers.
Right. So we generally do act in collaboration with other organizations, such as the, you know, indigenous groups I outlined, as well as Sunrise and Diabo Rising. And so we do work in collaboration and network.
This is also a good moment, speaking of collaborations, to mention Han wanted to relay that there's a spokes council, including Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise. I'm not sure all the names of the groups that are working on this, but I think Sierra Club would be invited if someone is interested in being a representative from Sierra Club to join this spokes council in collaborating on responses to possible election situation. As that unfolds over the next few months, there is some work around that. And so I'm just relaying that if there's interest in that.
Thank you. Thank you for that invitation. Molly, circling back, or all of you circling back, I mean, you mentioned BlackRock, you mentioned Chase. Tell us what they did in response to the pressure that you've put on them.
Liz, you're putting the pressure on us. So really. BlackRock promised that they weren't going to invest in more fossil fuels. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
They totally divested, I'm pretty sure, right?
I think the Sierra Club people may know more about this than I do. Perfectly honest. And so there was, and that announcement came the day after we worked with the youth and had a protest in front of BlackRock in San Francisco, downtown. Yep. So we felt pretty good about that. And just to add that we followed a lot of leadership from the youth and the young people. And, you know, Sunrise has been a major group. There is a Sunrise over 35 group as well that we, you know, may have some collaboration with, but ours is an intergenerational group as well. We have young people and grandmothers like me, and we have affinity groups that we have formed in order to be together and determine how we may want to participate in actions.